to teach truth. In Matthew 22, it says, "But Jesus answered and said to them," the Sadducees who were questioning about the resurrection, "You are mistaken, not understanding the Scripture nor the power of God." So Jesus demonstrated in the Gospels that he confronted error and corrected erroneous views. He was not accommodating the erroneous cultural beliefs of his day. In John 5, Jesus said, "Do not think that I will accuse you before the Father. The one who accuses you is Moses, in whom you have set your hope. For if you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. But if you do not believe his writings, how will you believe my words?" Jesus makes a very strong connection between the teachings of Moses in the first 5 books of the Old Testament and his own teachings. And so it is a very serious thing how we view those early chapters of Genesis. Another evidence that Genesis 1 to 11 is history is the view of the biblical writers. In Ezekiel 14:14, "Even though these 3 men, Noah, Daniel, and Job, were in its midst, in the midst of Israel, by their own righteousness they could not deliver themselves, declares the Lord." So in Ezekiel's mind, Noah and Daniel and Job were all equally historical men. In Luke 23, we have the genealogy of Jesus, and starts with him being the supposed son of Joseph, the son of David, the son of Abraham, the son of Noah, the son of Adam, and the son of God. And all of those people existed in real history, or Jesus is a descendant of a myth. He's not a real human being. If that genealogy breaks down into a mythological character at any point, then Jesus was not a real human being. In Romans chapter 5, Paul says, "Just as through one man sin entered into the world, and death through sin, and so death spread to all men because all sin." Paul builds his whole doctrine of sin and death and justification by faith on the historicity of Adam and the fall. In fact, in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul calls Adam the first Adam, and he calls Jesus the last Adam. In 2 Peter, Peter talks about the fact that Noah was preserved from the flood, that he was saved with 7 others. Peter picks up on that little detail. And he then talks about Sodom and Gomorrah being reduced to ashes. Well, Sodom and Gomorrah is described in Genesis 18 and 19. Peter clearly took that as historical fact, and virtually all Old Testament scholars, at least all evangelical Old Testament scholars, accept Genesis 12 to 50 as history. Peter accepted the first part of Genesis as history also. In Romans 1, For the invisible things of God from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. This verse also shows, just like Mark 10 showed that Jesus was a young earth creationist, this verse shows that Paul was a young earth creationist. Because this phrase, from the creation of the world, the word "from" there is the Greek word "apa," and you could take it as a source genitive. That is, I got this water from the drinking fountain. The drinking fountain was the source of the water. Or you could say, I came from Aurora, Indiana this morning to the conference. But that same preposition can also be a temporal genitive. So, I have been here from 8:30 this morning. That means since 8:30 this morning. I didn't come out of 8:30. That wasn't the source of my presence here. That was the time at which I came here. And there's good reasons to conclude that in Romans 1:20, Paul is not simply saying that from the present creation, people are without excuse for not believing in God. He is talking about all of humanity through all of history. So he's saying, since the creation of the world, God's invisible attributes have been seen, so that all people in all times, in all cultures, are without excuse for rejecting the testimony in creation and in the conscience. And in fact, the NAS, the ESV, the Holman Christian Study Bible, the New King James, and the New Revised Standard all translate that Greek word as since. And I think there's good reasons. Paul would have thought, for example, of Psalm 19:1, the heavens declare the glory of God. He would have thought of Job chapter 12, where God says, Job says, speak to the earth, speak to the birds, speak to the animals. They will tell you that God made them. So ever since the creation of the world, God's attributes have been seen. Well, that clearly implies that Adam was right back there at the creation of the world. The creation wasn't in existence for billions of years with no human beings to observe the witness of the Creator. Humans were right back there at the beginning. Isaiah says the same thing. Do you not know? Have you not heard? Has it not been declared to you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the world? There you see that Hebrew parallelism again. So from the beginning is another way of saying from the foundations of the earth. And he says, have you not known this about God from the foundations of the earth? In other words, man was right back there at the beginning, and he could know these things about God. So the Bible is very clear that man and the creation are the same age. Man has been around minus 5 days. Man has been around exactly the same amount of time as the rest of creation. And there's a chapter in Coming to Grips with Genesis I do a chapter on what Jesus thought about the age of the earth, and then the next chapter is all about the whole rest of the New Testament and its witness to the literal truth of Genesis. So, great chapter in there. The biblical writers didn't know the difference between truth or myth, it has been objected. You know, they were pre-scientific, primitive, superstitious people way back there 2,000 years ago. We're a lot smarter. We know how to tell the difference between truth and myth. But those people, you know, there was a lot of mythology, Greek mythology, and they just didn't know the difference. Wrong. 2 Timothy chapter 4, and I think in your notes I've given you several other verses. And they will turn, Paul said, they will turn away their ears from the truth and will turn aside to myths. The Greek word there is muthos, from which we get the English word myth. Paul clearly understood the difference between myth and truth. And the other verses that I gave you show the same thing. But the Bible is not a science textbook. How many have ever heard that? You creationists, you're ridiculous. This is not a science textbook. And our response is, praise God. Because if it was, we'd have to change the Bible every couple of years, because that's how often they change the science textbooks. But this statement reveals a real confusion about the nature of science. There are two broad categories of science: operation science and origin science, or experimental science and historical science. And they're two very different ways at exploring the question of what is true. Operation science it uses one basic method to get at the truth. And operation science would include experimental physics, experimental biology, chemistry, medical research, engineering research. And this is the science that gives us our technology. It gives us cures to disease. It gives us the space shuttle, cell phones, computers. And it uses what we call the scientific method. And that is the use of observable, repeatable experiments in a controlled environment to discover patterns of recurring behavior in the present physical universe. So, you want to know what is the cause of AIDS. So you study the HIV virus in the laboratory, and you control the environment, you control the variables to isolate just one variable, and you do an experiment to test your hypothesis. And you're looking for how things repeat themselves so that you can figure out how to destroy this virus. As I said, that's often called experimental science, and that's where we get our technologies. But origin science is very different. Fields of origin science include historical geology, paleontology, archaeology. You could even call criminal investigation a form of origin science. You want to know who done it or what done it in the past. And so it uses the legal historical method, which can be defined this way. the use of reliable eyewitness testimony, if any is available, and circumstantial evidence to determine the cause or causes of some past unobservable singular event which has left evidence in the present. So, my son is a sheriff's deputy down in Florida. He comes to a house and there's a dead body on the floor. He wants to know, how did that body get dead? Was it murder? Was it suicide? Was it accidental death? And so he has to study the circumstantial evidence. Is there a gun on the floor? Is there a hole in the head? Is there a pool of blood on the floor? And then he wants to look for any eyewitnesses to solve the case. I was just in the Grand Canyon with Dr. Andrew Snelling last week. That's a big hole in the ground, 4 to 18 miles wide, 277 miles long, and a mile deep. How'd it get there? Nobody was there to observe it, so I got to study this circumstantial evidence. The rock layers, the fossils, characteristics of the rock layers, to try to reconstruct the unobserved past. Completely different. You can't recreate the Grand Canyon in the lab. You can't recreate the dead body in the laboratory. You can't raise him up and then kill him again, see if that was the way it happened. So this is historical science, and a lot of people look at the success of Operation Science and say, well, look at all the technology. This is proof that science works. And therefore, what the origin scientists are telling us about the history of the world and the age of the earth, that must be true too, because we have space shuttles and refrigerators. It's a complete confusion of categories. And so we say, well, the Bible's not a science textbook, but it is the history book of the universe. It tells us how this world came into existence and what's happened to it and what will happen to it in the future. So you have these various compromise views, and let's just look at a few objections that flow out of these views. One is the gap theory. And people will say, okay, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. That was way back in the past, 14 billion years ago. And the formation of stars and the rock layers with all those fossils in them, all that death, that happened before verse 2. And then the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. And then you have 6 literal days of recreation. That's not a good way of looking at the text for a lot of reasons, but one is we get back to the Hebrew verb again. You remember I talked about the fact that in verse 1 we have a verb in the perfect verb form, and then in verse 3 we have the vav consecutive. The Hebrew conjunction vav, which can be translated as and or then or now, depending on the context, and running through. But verse 2 begins a different way. It does not begin with the vav connected to the imperfect verb. It begins with vav attached to the noun, the earth. So it's a very different construction, and Hebrew scholars call this a vav disjunctive rather than a vav consecutive. And it means that verse 2 is a little parenthetical statement saying something about what the earth was like when God first created it. The narrative of events goes from verse 1 to verse 3. Verse 2 is not part of the narrative of events, it's just describing what the earth was like. There's no gap of millions of years in between those verse 1 and 3. And the greatest defense or refutation of the gap theory is the book Unformed and Unfilled, written about 3 decades ago, but still an excellent refutation of that point by an Old Testament scholar. The days of Genesis 1, Ken talked about this last night, so I'm just going to briefly remind you that the Hebrew word for day, yom, is defined the very first time it's used in the Old Testament. It's defined literally in verse 5 as the light portion of the light-dark cycle and the whole light-dark cycle. It's modified by numerical adjectives, first day, or 1 day, second day, third day, fourth day. And everywhere in the Old Testament where yom is modified by a number, it always means a literal day. The context makes that perfectly clear. It's also used with evening and morning, and everywhere those Hebrew words, evening and morning, are used, either together or separately with yom in the context or not, the context shows they're clearly literal evenings and literal mornings of literal days. And then yom is defined again in verse 14 when God created the sun, moon, and stars. You see, Adam and Eve were not created with a wristwatch or a calendar. So how are they going to tell time? Well,